Okay, so let's get on with the public part of Governance SPC for this afternoon. So we will start with the roll call. Mr. Westerson.
Councillor Middleton Hope. Oh, sorry.
Present.
This gets big. Acting Mayor Dodick.
Present.
Councillor Carlson.
Present.
And Councillor Croson, or Deputy Mayor Croson, sorry.
Present here.
Excellent. And I see we have several members of administration both in the room and online on Teams as well. Councillor Schmidt-Rempel is here in the room with us as well.
All right, thank you very much. So let us get started with the acknowledgement statement. The City of Lethbridge acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains and pays respect to the Blackfoot people past, present, and future while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The City of Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. So we have before us our agenda. We have 2 items under submissions and then a confidential item under 7. Can I get a motion to adopt the agenda? All right. Councillor Middleton Hope, all in favor? Perfect. We next have the consent agenda. We have our minutes from the November 25th meeting, and we have the status of initiatives. Are there any questions or concerns about anything on the consent agenda? Okay. Seeing none, can I get a motion to accept the consent agenda? Councillor Middleton Hope, all in favor? You were just a little too slow, Councillor Carlson. Must be a bit of a delay. All right, so there are no presentations. We jump then into submissions. And we have a submission from Ms. Hilford, the City Clerk, regarding the census of 2022. Background information was provided on that about canceling the census. Supposed to have been last year, we moved it to this year, et cetera. And the recommendation coming forward from administration is to cancel the 2022 municipal census. You'll see there as well that with the federal census numbers are supposed to be coming out, et cetera. So let's just start with, are there any questions? I know Ms. Hilford is here, as are other members of the City Clerk's Department, if anyone has questions. Okay, Councillor Middleton Hope.
Thank you. I'm sorry, this caught me a little bit off guard, but recently there were numbers published in the newspaper in regards to an increase in population for the city of Lethbridge. Clearly that was not part of a census, so I'm interested to determine where that information might have come from. Do we have any idea, Ms. Hilford?
Thank you for the question, Councillor Middleton Hope. I am not familiar with any increased numbers being published in the paper. I'm going to look to the deputy if he's familiar, but it wouldn't have come from our office.
There was an indication that it was the lowest increase in population in the last 20 years. Be that as it may, are we still not, we have not done a census in 2021. We've proposed not to do a census in 2022. Correct me if I'm wrong, is this not tied to many of the forms of funding that we have in terms of population base versus the funds that we are able to acquire?
It used to be, and that changed as of 2019. So no longer will census numbers be dependent or provide funding.
And last comment is in regards to the accuracy of the federal census process. Having been a part of this for a number of years, they consistently get it wrong. And if that matters to anybody, they consistently get the populations of the city of Lethbridge and our CMA wrong. So they don't seem to rely on the information that we provide through our on-the-ground census. Does that cause a concern to the city manager or to the corporation in any way?
I can't speak to federal census numbers. We are awaiting those numbers, and then we will analyze those numbers. But until we see them, we won't really know how accurate or inaccurate they are. So,
I think I think as if I might, as
Ms. Hilford's indicated in the report, there are two concerns. One is the accuracy of the federal census, which, as she said, we'll get a sense of. The second is the formula that the province intends to use to determine the allocation of grants. And until we see both of those, I think once we see both of those, we'll be in a better position to recommend to council whether or not we need to continue, or we recommend continuing with the municipal census. And the other reasons for doing that are mentioned in the report. To have a better sense for projected growth and infrastructure planning and other things. But I think the recommendation brought forward by Ms. Hilford, given the current state of play, makes good sense at this time.
Just one final comment in that regard. As I read the motion, does it not indicate that we're going to forego the census in 2022? Did I read that wrong?
No, that's correct, suggesting having it done, not done this year. My question would be, are you suggesting we do it in 2023 then? What's the future plan after this?
We do have budget every year set aside for census, and we've not had to ask council for it, but because of what's going on in the last few years, we wanted to keep council up to date and have a say in whether there should be a census or not. So I think we just kind of have to wait and see what's going on with the environment and COVID, look at the federal numbers and such, and then we will make a decision next year for 2023.
That was the previous one from 2020, was to determine, like, have it in 2021, not have it in 2022, and then consider 2023. And we're just suggesting not have it for 2022, consider 2023 as per the old resolution.
Correct.
So is there, and have you heard from anyone who relies on the census? Are there organizations that are saying we have to do this? Like, has anybody come up and said, oh, no, you guys shouldn't have canceled last year?
Oh, we haven't heard that. No one has said that we shouldn't have canceled based on what's going on in the environment with COVID and such. Economic development, they like the data, just like some of our departments in the city, but they understand what's going on. And the federal numbers, again, they will be coming this year.
And I agree with Councillor Middleton Hope. They tend to be wrong because they take them at a different time of year than we do. Not necessarily wrong, but reflective of, we make sure we do it when the post-secondary students are here, let's be honest, and gets us our best numbers. So it'll be different, but it'll still be helpful for anyone who needs it. Okay. Any other questions or concerns about moving this resolution forward to council?
Madam Chair, my hand's been up. I don't know if you can see.
Now you're glowing yellow, sorry.
Oh, no problem. And thank you. It's sort of piggybacking on your last question about, but yours was mostly about external stakeholders. A lot of the data we collect in our own census is used for various purposes within the corporation. Have we experienced any challenges? So through you to city manager, perhaps, any challenges in not having that information, or are there other ways that we've gotten the data that we need for transportation routes, et cetera?
Yeah, certainly the municipal census is very valuable internally to work to look at things like infrastructure planning and managing growth. I think that the sense that folks have now is, given the environment out there, there makes little sense, and we're not even sure it would be practical to do it in 2022. So we really don't have much choice. If we were to do it in 2022, we're not confident in the process and we're not confident in the data. So for a short period of time, we're just left to deal with the utility or not of the federal census. The other piece to keep an eye on is the grant funding associated with the new provincial formula, and we still, as Ms. Hilford indicated, don't know what that formula is going to look like. But no, what we would intend to do is come back to council with a recommendation for whether to pick it back up in 2023. But clearly, the reason it was done every year for many decades is because there's real value in those numbers.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I do have an answer from Mr. Westerson for your question, Councillor Middleton Hope. You did see something accurately. It was actually released from the federal government. The annual demographic estimates were released on Thursday, 2 weeks ago. The population of the Lethbridge Census Metropolitan Area has grown by 0.9% from July 2020 to July 1st, 2021. So it is actually, they are releasing this year, but they're releasing it in dribs and drabs, some of the census material. So yeah, we've grown by 0.9%. I'm going to assume mostly on the west side. Any other questions? What's the general feeling from the SBC members? Do we agree with this as the motion? Be it resolved that the Governance Standing Policy Committee recommend that Council cancel the 2022 municipal census?
Madam Chair, I'm willing to make that motion if necessary.
Okay. So we have the motion brought forward by Councillor Carlson. All in favor? Any opposed? You can't abstain unless you have a conflict of interest and if, okay. All right, Integrity Commissioner. Do we have online members of the, perfect. All right, so we have kicked this around a few times. It went to council just recently. They gave their menu options that they want. It has now reflects those options. And if all goes well, if everybody's agreeing with the bylaws that are suggested, et cetera, we would then take this back to council on March 1st and see if this will pass council as a whole. So we start there. Mr. Faust, is there anything we need to add that, to our conversation at this time?
Thank you, Councillor Crowson. There isn't really, but I will add that there's one other point that I think we need to consider, and that's the structure of the hiring committee and that piece of the process. It can be a formal committee. I think internally in the solicitor's office, we'd always sort of envisioned a more informal committee for it, possibly even if it gets referred back to governance to create a short list that's eventually presented and decided by council. It's something that it's not clearly defined in the materials, but that part of the process does need to be defined, I think.
I think you're absolutely right, because I can imagine our colleagues at council, that will be a question they ask going, okay, so we passed this, if they pass this, so what's the next step? So the next step then would be to look at hiring. We would have basically the job description here. So what are people thinking? Again, a little bit backwards. But if this does get passed by our colleagues, are we thinking governance as the hiring committee? Are we thinking recommending a small informal hiring committee? It can't, well, we'd have to call it a task force, because one thing we know about our solicitors department, if it's an actual committee, it'd have to have a bylaw, so we'd have to be aware of that as well. What are people thinking? If that question is asked at council, what would be our recommendation? I don't think anybody has any real opinion. I haven't seen any hands.
Yep.
Go ahead, John.
Just thinking in terms of optics, the selection of this person, the roles and responsibilities, as I see the roles and responsibilities, the focus is predominantly, Mr. Faust, on council itself and their activities. Is that correct?
That's correct. This role would be entirely focused on council.
So then should we be selecting somebody who is going to be providing that oversight to council? Or should that be done externally? In other words, should human resources be doing that? Should we stay out of the process altogether? I'm just simply raising the issue.
So, Mr. Faust, if you were looking to external counsel for some issue, how would they be hired?
Typically, it would be hired by the city solicitor, and we do try and somewhat spread it around to not show favoritism within the firms. There is only select firms that have municipal experience. I can tell you, with regards to hiring committees, Surrey in BC went through this in 2020. It was a big issue in the municipal campaign there, and they did have a couple of members of administration and some from the public, I believe, on the hiring committee. But they also had an official bylaw with terms of reference for an established committee.
Okay. Yeah, this is a bit of a strange one. You're right. The optics of hiring your own integrity commissioner does have a bit of a, so why are you hiring an integrity commissioner if you're going to decide who's the integrity commissioner? So there is that optics that is part of it. Reiko?
Yeah, I probably should have asked this question a long time ago, but better late than never. The integrity commissioner can determine whether there's been a violation of the code, and then council can then impose sanctions if they choose to do so. but I don't see any appeal mechanisms. So what happens in the situation? Well, in the situation when the council is found to be contrary to the code, and all of a sudden they decide, you know, I really don't agree with the integrity commissioner. I would like to appeal that decision. How do you deal with that? Because most concepts involving natural justice have a right of appeal somewhere built in there.
You're right, and it's not something that's directly addressed in the materials, and I don't think any of the other cities have directly addressed it. Ultimately, the determination whether there's been a violation or not rests with council. And there are appeals within the sanctions within the MGA aren't necessarily just for council themselves, right? They can pass the sanctions, but if you really want to enforce, say, removing a member, it needs to go to the Court of Queen's Bench for an order. But ultimately, they're really an investigator, an initial fact finder, filterer, but it's still council's bylaw, it's still council's code, and it's council's decision whether or not to impose sanctions, if any.
So I don't think that still answers the question. Are you saying that in the, not outside the integrity commissioner, what's the appeal process for the bylaw itself?
No, the integrity commissioner, in a report to the council on whether a member has violated the code, okay? So they can report that a code has been violated.
Right.
So I'm asking, the integrity commissioner does not, as is pointed out, impose the sanction. But how do you appeal the finding of the integrity commissioner that the code has been violated? So he or she goes to council in a report and says, Councillor ABC did XYZ contrary to the code. And the councillor goes, well, you know what? I disagree. I would like to appeal that or have that reheard or things of that nature. So I'm just asking if there's somewhere, whether it's implicit or explicit, well, certainly not explicit, but is there something implicit that allows a council member to dispute the findings of the integrity commissioner, but because it's not contained in the bylaw or any of the material I've seen?
18.15 says the member can have their own legal counsel, and I assume that person would be the one who would bring up if they're, you know, those questions.
Yes.
Am I reading more into that than I should? Because I assume that's where the appeal comes from, is your counsel goes, yeah, no.
No. The council you can have council present to argue on your behalf saying, no, you didn't do it. But once a decision has been made by the integrity commissioner, irrespective of whether you had counsel or not, I'm asking what happens after that point if the councillor wants to appeal the findings of the commissioner.
Okay.
That's the question I have.
Mr. Faust, how would you answer that?
Councillor Druk, I think it's a great point, and I think it's implicit within the process of when the findings of the integrity commissioner are made, they go first to the complainant before any of the other councillors see it, and then just before an in-closed session, then the other councillors get it, and the purpose of the delay is to give the alleged councillor, the one that's been alleged wrongdoing, chance to prepare a reply. It would ultimately go to a discussion in closed session, and our thought would be that's when, if they didn't agree, they would make some sort of submissions or possibly apologize, steps of mitigation as to wrongs or explanations at that point.
So is that enough for what you're thinking of, Reiko, or do you want that more explicit in the bylaw? That
No, I was just curious about it because, you know, I'm not trying to make a big point here because I don't think this is something that's going to come up a lot. When I see the numbers in Edmonton and Calgary, it's not a huge amount. I just sort of wanted people to be live to the issue that the bylaw doesn't specifically speak to the ability of the person against whom a complaint is made to appeal a decision of the integrity commissioner. But I think perhaps the rules of natural justice allow you to do that in any event. So
again, not going into details, but when we did see this in practice, you better believe the person who was in front of the rest of their colleagues did give their perspective very strongly.
Cal Surprise. Thank you.
Any other questions or concerns about what we have in front of us? Go ahead.
So just one, a question to Mr. Faust. So who determines the veracity of the complaint? I presume it's the investigator or the integrity commissioner, but is it explicitly articulated in there that this person determines the veracity of the complaint, or is he or she merely a receptacle of the complaint and then passes it on to or presents it to council so that council can make a determination whether it's a bona fide complaint or not? Because we must anticipate that there are going to be vexatious complaints. Some may be frivolous, but there will be some vexatious complaints in the future.
Councillor Milton Hope, and it is explicitly set out that the Integrity Commissioner is the filterer and can just summarily dismiss frivolous, vexatious complaints or complaints that are outside of their jurisdiction. There may be legitimate complaints about whether a bylaw is legal or ultra vires and not able to be passed, but has nothing to do with the code of conduct.
Okay, thank you.
Rachel, I see you're yellow again. And you're muted.
Sorry, I forgot to take it off. Now I'm unmuted. Now
Yep. I find that I often have a dangling hand when I'm on Teams. My hand always stays up. Okay, Jeff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question about moving forward. What are the timelines on this? In the financial discussions, it just keeps saying there will be a cost, but none of the possible costs are outlined that I could find. So maybe somebody could help me with what's the timeline for this, and what are the financial impacts or possibilities, and is this something we would implement now or have this come during budget?
So you're actually just, Mr. Westerson and I are having some of that conversation because, yeah, the funding source has never been actually stated on any of the documents, so that's something we would have to do.
It was contemplated.
One of our deadlines is March 1st. That is when we said we would bring this back to council, though we also told them if something changed that, we would let them know and ask for an extension. So what we are looking at right now is to take it back to council, if it's in agreement, to look at implementation of the Integrity Commissioner and bring forward the recommended bylaw changes to the Code of Conduct bylaw. But you're right, we do need to also have those ideas with them. Is this going immediate? Do we want this implemented, as soon as it's passed, sort of thing? Do we want this implemented at the beginning of next year? Do we want to take this to budget? Do we want, and the funding sources? And then the other question about if this is passed, how would a person be hired? So those are sort of some of the questions up in the air that we need to have a decision on, if we can, today. Now,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Faust, is there a recommended budget source on this? Or
Let me make sure I'm unmuted.
Mr. Dalton or anyone?
Councillor Croson, the initial suggested pot was city council surplus, I understand. And as far as amounts go, we've always been sort of toying with the idea of a $2,000 a month retainer with a $200 hourly rate over and above that, if that's used up. And that's in line with what Edmonton uses for their ethics advisor role. It's also in line with what St. Albert had for their integrity commissioner. They had a $2,000 monthly retainer, $200 hourly rate. And I can tell you when they first put that in place in 2020, their cost was $27,000. They had 2 complaints.
Okay, so we're looking, if we even just skyball at $40,000 a year. And the better we behave, the cheaper that is. Would that be an accurate sort of round figure, 40,000, if we to take back to council? Okay, I'm not hearing from anybody. Mr. Dalton, would that be accurate?
Yeah, we're doing some pretty loose math, but based on the numbers that Adam just shared and what Edmonton and Calgary experienced, my math, which is not my strong suit, would suggest that's in the ballpark, but we might want to I don't know, Adam, if we've got a really good sense for that, or if we want to go do a little more work on it.
It's a difficult issue to do more work on, and one of the reasons is that we had the existing process is quite informal. So as administration, I don't know what complaints came over the past year or so. We're not privy to that, and nor should we really be under the existing framework. So it's a little bit, it is up in the air because we don't actually know all the information as to the complaints. What we can do is try and manage and set a reasonable baseline, which would be the $2,000 a month retainer, and try and extract value from that as far as the education piece goes when there aren't complaints, and then set a reasonable hourly rate. But if there's a really complicated investigation, then we're going to need to look at it, and the investigator's going to have to investigate it. But with that also, if the cost is greater than we had expected, the position can ultimately be retained or ceased by resolution of council.
Okay, so there's a backup plan. If we find we're spending way too much money, that's going to look great in the public, I must tell you, that we've had so many in that we're getting rid. So just be aware of that as part of that decision making. But again, we're going to have sort of a idea of total numbers. So 40,000, 50,000, something that if somebody on council asks, we can say, we don't think it'll be more than this. Would that be in the ballpark, 40, 50,000?
I think that's a reasonable number.
Okay.
I don't expect it to be there. Just hearing from anecdotal information or reading between the lines of what's occurred the past year or so, I don't imagine that number would be overpassed.
And next question is quite obviously going to be, is that in the surplus? Is there money there? Jeff thinks there is, but
And that's a question that I'll have to do more digging on.
Last time we had an update on council's budget, there was a surplus, and I think it was fairly high, unless we got rid of that in the last go round of budget discussions.
okay. So we'll move forward. If this resolution moves forward, we'll make the resolution the funding source to be council surplus, 50,000 max sort of thing. And if this does go forward, we have time before the March 1st meeting to make any adjustments that we need to in whatever goes to agenda review committee. Would that work? I see Jeff is before me. Okay, Jeff, go ahead.
Thank you. Appreciate the discussion on these points. And I believe what and correct me if I'm wrong because I've read through it 1,000 times, and 2B, 2C, 2A, 1 has sort of flummoxed me. We're looking at 2B, correct? Not 2B.
Option 1 and 2B are what we have been given direction by from council.
Thank you. That's what my assumption has been going on. So in 2B, if my recollection serves, there was also the opportunity, and I believe it was called preemptive ethical advice, something.
Ethics advisor, yeah.
Yeah, something like. I don't see any of the information of how that would work and what the process would be on that. And say we've got one counselor who really has some thoughts or issues and uses up all the retainers. So I'm just wondering if we've identified that process and how those other services would be utilized.
Okay, Mr. Faust, how have you seen that done in other places?
And perhaps I missed it, Adam. I'm sorry if I did.
For jurisdictions that have had the combined position, they've used a similar format that you'll see. That process really outlined in the draft proposed bylaw. So it's on page 11 of 16 of tab 7, and it's 17.0.6.
Can you direct me again?
Page 11 of 16. 7.
11 of 16. Okay, I'm on 11 of 16. Thank you.
17.0.6.
Yep, thank you.
So this is the process framework for how it would happen, in that the member would make the request, the integrity commissioner would ask the questions, kind of get a real sense of the situation, make an advanced ruling, and then what that ruling ultimately does is, if a complaint arises, especially if it's one based on perception rather than fact, then the integrity commissioner is really bound by that ruling, unless the facts change, right? Unless you've sort of gilded the lily of the facts and given a different spin to it. You raise an interesting question, though, about what if someone just uses it all up? And the thought behind having these people aren't necessarily going to operate in a vacuum by themselves on an island with no communication. And I think it's important that it be explained too, that whoever fills this role, if they're getting questions, that should inform their education piece. Not a specific of, Councillor John Doe, you said this and here is the answer. But if someone's asking a question, then it's out there and it should be known, and maybe it's not known to everyone. So I see that as informing the ongoing education, but it is an interesting question. And I don't know if it defeats the purpose by limiting it to councillor only gets 3 advanced rulings a year or term.
No, I guess, and thank you, Mr. Faust. So the advanced rulings was the preemptive ethical advice that was contemplated. Okay, and maybe I was a bit unclear about what that meant. So what types? Maybe talk me through one, because I was thinking of something completely different, something that just sort of pops up, and sometimes things do at a meeting, where you've got the sheet, and then during a meeting someone says, I'm here representing blah blah blah, and a councillor goes, oh, that might put me in a conflict, I'm not sure. So there's no immediate call to a lawyer, one call free, so to speak. This is all done somewhat in advance, obviously. So I'm curious, tell me how that would, could you describe a situation where this would be utilized, and better yet, describe a situation that could come up on the fly where it couldn't be utilized? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. So an example of when it could be utilized, let's say council gets the agenda, and in there this is an example that's been used previously in earlier materials. There's a rezoning application, and it's contentious, and it's from a developer, and you as a councillor play hockey with that developer, and you're frequently seen out at the bars with the developer, and maybe it turns out you're the last vote, right? You're the last person to vote. That would be one where if you immediately have your spidey senses tingling, well, I have a relationship with this individual. We're friends, we're on the same team. I don't necessarily like him, he doesn't share the puck. You could ask the integrity commissioner there, here's the situation, am I in a conflict? And then they could provide you with advice. And that's one where I'd referenced earlier, where perception may be, ooh, are they friends? Are they doing something, backdoor deal? But the reality is, no, you're not. And maybe the integrity commissioner's investigation determines, oh, actually, this councillor does not care for that individual at all. But they do always seem to mingle in the same groups.
Okay.
One that wouldn't...
Mr. Faust, that probably answers enough of my question, because it's exactly what I was hoping to hear. Where would the time frame be laid out? I guess in the contract with the party, because say agenda review meets on a Tuesday, the agenda comes out on a Thursday, I crack it Friday night. how speedily can we expect a response in that situation?
Mr. Matthews is on the line as well.
And that'll be my final thought of that. I see Reiko's hand is up, but is that something that would be laid out in the contract or contemplated?
It's currently not laid out or contemplated, but it raises a very good point in that if
We
there's
don't have
if
a
there's
path.
if there's time for if there's time for that advanced ruling, it's really beneficial. And there is going to be a point where it's too late, right? The day before council, because ultimately the integrity commissioner in this role needs to be able to have the opportunity to make a fulsome investigation, even if that investigation is only a couple of questions over the phone or just looking at some documents or an email. If there's a desire to put in a limit, we could do it. I'm also leaning towards adding in language such as reasonable advance notice of it. And then it's not defined, but there's an understanding that people need to try and give time for the actual investigation to occur.
Okay, thank you.
That answers your
Madam Chair.
questions? Okay, I'm just going to pause. I know I have a couple questions coming up, but I believe Mr. Matthews has joined us. So let's see if we can get the answer to that question we had earlier. We are looking at the Integrity Commissioner. The funding source has been suggested from City Council surplus, and we're suggesting a budget of up to $50,000 a year. So two questions, Mr. Matthews. One, is there money in City Council surplus? Two, is that a good place to take this from? So if anything you can add to our conversation around those.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, Councillor Crowson. So one of the things that I would suggest here, that I think $50,000 seems reasonable, and based on the September forecast, Council was expecting to have $130,000 inside of there, and of course another $200,000 was carried over from 2020, so it's sufficient funding inside of that carryover for the 2022. So what I would suggest, my suggestion would be, if this meets Council's direction, would be to suggest the $50,000 for 2022 comes out of the Council, and that we bring forward an initiative as part of the 2023 to 2026 operating budget, where we put this into the base budget. So an initiative would come forward as a decision point on that, so the $50,000 per year as part of the discussions in the fall and November.
I like that because it almost gives us a pilot program. We try it for 2022, and then we have an even more fulsome discussion with the 2023 budget. And if we've seen things that work or don't work, that gives everybody on council a chance to argue it. All right, thank you for that information. Reiko, I know your hand's been up for a while.
Yeah, well, my question was prompted by the response Mr. Faust gave to Jeff's question, and which causes me a bit of concern, because based on the response, it's almost like the Integrity Commissioner is providing legal advice on matters, for example, that are covered by the Municipal Government Act. So the example that was used was playing hockey with someone, having a few drinks with them, and all of a sudden you're involved in a vote that involves them. Now, under the Municipal Government Act, the only time that you cannot not vote is when you have a clear conflict of interest or a pecuniary interest. In this particular case, there's no pecuniary interest because the vote doesn't in any way impact on, for example, anything to do with the councillor. So you get into a situation where the Integrity Commissioner may say, well, you know, this doesn't smell right, or it has optics are not good. But under the Municipal Government Act, you actually have to vote on it because you don't apply for one of the exemptions that allows you not to vote in the MGA. So in essence, if we're letting the Integrity Commissioner do more than just investigate ethical breaches or potential ethical breaches, and actually giving legal advice, in essence, as to how to interpret the MGA, I think we're going far afield and basically giving free lawyers to counselors so they can determine whether or not they're afoul of the MGA, and that's within their own responsibility. So, for example, I can't go to the city solicitor or his office and say, look, here's my situation. Can I vote on this particular matter? And the solicitor will likely say, well, if this, then that, if this, then that, but you might want to get your own legal counsel to look at carefully, which is the appropriate answer to give. And yet, on a optics conflict situation, you might have the integrity commissioner say, well, maybe you shouldn't vote on it, and then run afoul of the MGA because you walk out of the meeting saying the integrity commissioner has told me that maybe I shouldn't vote. Do you see the conundrum I have, Mr. Faust?
I do, Councillor Dodick, and I guess an issue with the conundrum is that in your example, the integrity commissioner has got it wrong. Right? They've given advice contrary to the MGA. And I think that's also important why we need to have someone with a strong municipal legal background to understand those differences. But ultimately, I think it's also important to remember that the preemptive advice is not a determination as to right or wrong, because ultimately that lies with council. It's really the integrity commissioner somewhat tying their own hands as far as their resultant report goes. Right? It's kind of preempting their investigation as if a complaint was made, but the determination is still council's. And yeah, I would agree that in your example, it's incorrect. The advice that's given, if there is no pecuniary interest, but what's important, I think, is if a councillor understands that they need to vote, they have to vote, but there isn't pecuniary interest, then it becomes one of optics and messaging, so that the councillor can ensure that that's known to the public after the vote if they so choose.
Okay, just to follow up to that, Mr. Faust, is the councillor who may think or believe, or someone has suggested that they have a pecuniary interest, isn't there an obligation on them to seek the appropriate advice? And it's not the function of the integrity commissioner, at least in the scenario that you've provided as the role of the integrity commissioner, to give that advice. In other words, the councillor has questions, or she has questions regarding pecuniary interest. That is something they should be dealing with their own lawyer and not using city-funded monies to get legal advice on issues such as that, as an example.
I would agree with that, Councillor Dodick, and I believe that is still remaining in the bylaw, the obligation to retain your own legal advice and counsel. The preemptive advice is not legal advice. It's a determination as to how they would find the facts, but they're ultimately not the trier of fact. If that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
Okay, John?
Thank you. And Mr. Faust, I come at this from a slightly different perspective, but I think as hard charging as my colleague did. Who do you envision is this investigator? Because the function, as I see here, it is to take complaints, to investigate complaints, to provide advice, to provide ethics training and so forth. This is a tall order. Having been involved in many of these facets, I can certainly tell you that you want someone, you're asking for someone who has some pretty refined skill sets. We're offering to pay them what will amount to about 3 hours worth of billable hours in a month. Ask Councillor Dodick, $2,000 doesn't go very far when you're dealing, and if we're expecting this person to have a legal background and to be able to provide a legal form of opinion, that doesn't mean that they're going to be a good investigator, because I can tell you, most lawyers aren't. But that also means that yes, I know it was a shot, but most investigators may not necessarily have the legal background. So how do you propose to blend this this Methuselah, who is going to be able to provide us with all of these skill sets at a bargain basement price?
You raise a really good point, and I entirely understand where you're coming from, because we are, in a sense, asking, we want the cake, right? And we want to eat it. The pool gets bigger if we're not limiting it to a local Lethbridge resident. Then there are law firms that can, I'm sure, have an associate or partner that may want to offer the service. We're also contemplating a handful of retired justices that may be available for it. But we are also looking to add to the complexity of it. If it's a lawyer, for example, we don't just want someone junior. Right? We need someone with real world experience, understands how these work. So it is a tall order, and we ultimately need to see who applies for the position. I will say that other cities don't seem to have that many issues in filling their positions. But if you were to look at, for example, in Ontario, most cities don't have a resident integrity commissioner. And one of the bases for that is that every city needs to have an integrity commissioner under their codes. So many cities have gone together and kind of got one for a group deal. But that means that they're not resident in the city, and I don't see anything here that necessarily requires them to be physically present. And that, I think, that opens up our pool.
So then, just as a brief follow-up to that, so you envision perhaps piggybacking in on another municipality's efforts in terms of identifying a person who fulfills the 3 key components of this role?
And not going jointly, but I raise that example to show that those cities are all operating, and on quite a few in Ontario, without someone physically there. This is a position that is open to remote work, I would say. And I think that opens our pool. If you were just looking at Lethbridge, our pool may be quite limited.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I agree with you 100%. I just think the 3 key components here of investigator, legal opinion, and ethics advisor. I mean, I spent the better part of the last 30 years doing ethical decision-making instruction at the graduate and undergraduate levels in university, and I can tell you, this is not an add-on position. This is a huge piece. So, and the legal piece, I would defer to my colleague, but the investigative piece, these skill sets are pretty challenging. So I'm just questioning in regards to if we were to remove one of the components of this, would it open up the pool for you in terms of being able to access somebody who perhaps was capable of administering the bylaw as you've proposed it?
Can I just stop? I think some of the questions you're asking are about like who to hire, how to hire.
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to solve that today. What I would suggest we add to this resolution is that governance SPC be given the right to develop with the city manager, and which would mean, of course, our city solicitor's department, the plan for how to hire. And that conversation could be had there. Would that work for everyone at this point? Because I think you're going more into that. And I think that's a more thorough discussion that we could get some information for to lead that discussion. Would that work at this point, is to have this come back to SPC once the bylaw changes, we have permission to hire, et cetera, if that all goes through, and have them direct it back to us to figure out how to hire.
Yeah, I think the how and the who are going to be important. The what, I think I can live with the way in which we've got it crafted now, but thank you for the clarification.
I think that's the next step. Is that in agreement, Mr. Faust?
I think that's a very practical approach to it. And I would just add a final comment that I know it seems like it's going to be a hard position to find the right person, but I really don't want this council to sell itself short and not get the best person possible for the role, as they're your integrity commissioner. If we hire them, they're helping you and they're ultimately investigating you as well. And I think it's important that we do believe that they meet these high standards that we've met, or we likely do not want to hire them.
When to start? Will this be started immediately after it gets passed?
There's just a conversation ongoing, Mr. Faust, but thank you for your observations.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One quick question, and then I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate. I believe, in addition to the preemptive ethical advice, one of the points of 2B was educational opportunities. Was that contemplated in the preemptive ethical advice, or is that something different? And if it is different, how would that be accomplished or utilized? I think the report said something about in the slow times or down times.
To make sure we
Yes,
use up the 2,000 a month.
Yes.
Councillor Carlson, it's something that came from St. Albert's experience. They only had an integrity commissioner, and they were paying the monthly retainer, but only had 2 complaints in 2020, but spent $27,000 for the 2 complaints. It doesn't seem like great value for your money in that sense. I would say the preemptive advice is only connected to the ongoing educational piece, as informing, I am getting questions about this type of issue. To Mr. Dodek's example, what is a pecuniary interest? Or this is an issue that just occurred in Calgary. Let's do a bulletin so that the councillors are aware of it. So that's what we had envisioned as far as the ongoing education piece. And when we say the downtime, it's when there isn't a complaint, but we still want to gain benefit from the money that we're putting out to this individual.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. That's kind of what I thought had been envisioned. And I guess all that would be accomplished in the contract or the tender, I guess, whatever you do. Because I didn't see that written out anywhere, unless you can tell me again. It's on page 17.7 that I missed. But how is that just in the details of the contract?
It's not set out as we need this number of bulletins per month, but it is in the terms of reference that there is an educational piece as well.
Thank you. I obviously did miss it.
And it's just that they'll provide ongoing education and advice.
Yes, and that I wasn't sure what the education comprised, so we'd have to work that out. Thank you for that. I guess just my final piece of devil's advocate. I think in my entire time on council, we've had one of these complaints come forward that move forward. Are there communities that don't have this type of position that handle these complaints, inquiries, whatever they may be called, without this position or this process?
There are numerous ones in Alberta. Almost all in BC don't. Surrey was one of the first, and they piggybacked on leveraging Alberta's requirement for a code and Ontario's requirement for a code and an integrity commissioner. And they were one of the first in BC. There are many that don't. I'd say right now, we're one of them, and the experience likely differs between them. I can also advise that St. Albert has just recently shifted to being an ad hoc hiring of an integrity commissioner, and it's their city solicitor that does the initial filtering and then hires someone to investigate if required. So there are some other ways to do it, and I think they likely all have their challenges and their benefits. I don't understand, or I can't provide information on how our current process has actually worked in practical application.
So what I'm hearing,
And I can't provide that because I can't provide that information because that is part and parcel with our current process. That's entirely insular.
what I'm hearing from Councillor Carlson's questions and questions from several people is why it's necessary that we sort of do this as a pilot. If we put this for 2022 it will have to be reviewed if we bring it forward as an initiative for the budget, and that will determine perhaps an ad hoc is a smarter way because we haven't used it at all. Or perhaps, so if we do put this as an initiative, would that be something that could be looked at as maybe there's just no necessity for somebody on retainer? Maybe it is ad hoc. Would we be okay with going forward with this as the recommendation, with those as backup options if we're going, yeah, we overstepped, this is way more than we need?
Madam Chair, I'm not sure you're asking that to.
I'm asking it to the three members of the committee.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'd like to explore this ad hoc idea a little bit. Just as I said, in my time on council, this has only actually ever, this complaint process has only ever been utilized once, and it wasn't onerous. Maybe I'm just very, very cheap, which most of my friends and family will tell you is true. And so I'm just struggling with a budget of up to $50,000 for something that, like, are we trying to find a solution to a problem that doesn't exist? It's just a thought. So I'd love to explore this ad hoc item a bit. And maybe it's just my frugal genetic makeup pushing me towards trying to find the cheapest possible solutions.
So go ahead and explore. Ask your questions.
Well, I guess I'd like to see how this ad hoc position worked, or system worked, where the city solicitor did the original filtering, and if it was thought, yep, this is actually going to take 20 hours, bring in an outside investigator. I've never even thought along different lines. So,
Councillor Carlson, the option 2C would essentially establish an ad hoc position, and our code is good in that it sets out quite a bit of the framework, but it doesn't set out the actual process of how do you hire someone. What does that person do once hired? And 2C, and it's ultimately attachment 6 to the materials, would be an investigator policy, which sets out how that investigator would be hired, what they would do, who would be hiring it, and we typically do it with through the city solicitor that would be hiring the individual. What I would say that having the city solicitor filter it is likely unique to St. Albert, but I can also advise that from reading the report of the Integrity Commissioner, it appears, and from reading council minutes, it appears that what occurred for them that caused them to switch was they had complaints based upon this was said in an email, and then a big investigation occurred when the email was always there. That nothing new came out because everyone agreed that this was said and this is the email. And so in those two examples, and it seems they were both quite similar, they didn't feel like they were getting the value for their money. When in that situation, it likely could have been determined, okay, the facts are, this is the email. Was it a breach? Was it not? And if it was, what sanction, talking to, apology, education about proper email etiquette? But if you're looking for an ad hoc approach, it is 2C.
Okay.
And then the only thing I would say is that establishes within our framework, it doesn't filter it through the city solicitor for that filtering part. That would be an additional step.
So thank you, because that was the difference. Because when I read 2C, it was basically our current process where either a committee of council was appointed as the investigator or an outside individual or firm could be sourced as the investigator. So that's pretty much what it is laying out in 2C, correct?
Correct, Councillor Carlson. And I will mention that this option came about from discussions in audit committee, and at the time it was the intention not to have administration involved in any of these, to keep the separation from, and not having them having to pick sides or get involved and then have to go and work with those councillors in a professional manner the next day or same day.
Right. So what would be proposed then if 2C suddenly became the flavor of the day? It would be our current process, and we would but allowing also public complaints rather than filtering through council. And then council or a committee of council would then decide whether, as you say, well, we all read the email, it's done. Or if there is more to it, you could go with an outside investigator. Is that what I'm understanding?
I understand it the same way, Councillor
Okay.
Carlson. So.
And remember, 2C did go forward to council. It was not the preferred choice by council. They did pick 2B.
Great, thank you.
So we are back to 2B. So moving ahead on this, Councillor Carlson, does that answer your questions about why the ad hoc was not the chosen one?
I think so.
Okay, so we're back to what we have on the table right now, and I'm going to ask Mr. Westerson to read out. As we've been listening to the conversations, he and I have been drafting a motion for discussion.
You want to read it?
I will read it, sure. All right. So be it resolved that the Governance Standing Policy Committee recommends City Council, 1, approve the establishment of the position of Integrity Commissioner and the terms of reference as in Attachment 5. And 2, direct the amendments to Bylaw 6125 as in Attachment 7. And 3, fund this position from the City Council 2019-2021 operating surplus, probably 2022, for up to a total of $50,000 for 2022. Am I wrong? And 4, direct administration to develop an initiative for the 2023-2026 operating budget deliberations for $50,000 per year. We might not put the number in there, for the position of an Integrity Commissioner. And further be it resolved that the Governance Standing Policy Committee recommends City Council direct the hiring process to the Governance Standing Policy Committee. So 4 steps. 1, approve the establishment of the position. 2, make the amendments to the bylaw that reflect this position. 3, fund it simply for this year, up to a maximum of $50,000, but it could be as low as less than $24,000 because we're already in January. And then have this reviewed, look at it as a pilot, create an initiative for the next operating budget. We have an amount in here. I would recommend no amount. I'd have that as part of administration's conversation. That is what having a straw dog resolution to discuss, that's what's before you. Rachel?
Yeah, just at the risk of being repetitive, it's a question and a comment I've made in prior standing policy committee meetings because the process is new to me. The resolution, for anyone who may be watching this, is basically for the Standing Policy Committee to refer this to City Council And if it was referred to City Council at that time, Council can debate the merits, wisdom of the resolution as they choose fit, and any vote they made at the SPC is certainly not binding on that member once they're on Council. I know I've asked this before. I know the answer. I just want confirmation that my understanding is correct. Thank you.
Yeah, it's just the consensus recommendation we're taking forward. You can always disagree with it, if that is the consensus we're taking forward. Anyone else have anything to, questions, concerns about, again, this is a draft now that we can make amendments to, changes to, take forward as is. Jeff?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just scrolling. So we were tasked by Council to only investigate option 1 and 2B. Is that correct?
In this last one, yes, that's what they sent back to us. We looked
Okay,
at the options, we recommended those 2 options to them, they agreed, they sent it back to us to fine tune.
Okay, so I guess the option in front of us is to refer or not refer back to Council. Question, because after several weeks of thought and mulling on this, my thoughts have changed. And so just a question, if something dies at committee, say we don't have anything to refer back to Council, and I'm sort of following up on Councillor Dodik's thought, what happens at Council? Could somebody just bring forward something new then?
We
Or is
still
that-
have to refer back, but the referral back can be a recommendation that, you know what, we took it to you, you sent it back to us, we realized we don't like it, our recommendation is, hey, we don't even need this. Like, that can be a recommendation. But it still has to be a recommendation back, final decision rests back with Council, but we can actually recommend against something, if that makes sense.
Agreed, and that's sort of where I'm leaning. I'll just air my thoughts, Madam Chair, sort of run it up the flagpole, see if the cheese stands alone. Option, as I've been mulling and mulling and mulling, option 2C seems much more I don't know. It seems much more to my liking, only because you're only spending the dollars when you have to. And some of these complaints could be handled rather speedily, and I'll use my term again, cheaply, by me. And so that's sort of where I'm leaning a bit. But
Now, 2C does not make any bylaw changes. So are you actually really looking for an amendment that is 2B and 2C combined? Has the bylaw changes with an integrity commissioner, but an ad hoc integrity commissioner?
And I'm wondering if that is somewhat what I'm leaning towards, because I do like the processes laid out. I think option 1 by itself includes that the public can directly make complaints that will be at least considered by Council, but it doesn't always go to an outside source, and we're not on the hook for dollars whether we utilize it or not. So it's just some thoughts out there of where I'm sort of leaning now.
Now, do keep in mind, the whole reason this was brought forward at all is because the 2 complaints that have gone forward did not go well when Council investigated themselves. Because there's,
Trying to recall. I recall one very well.
yes, and the difficulty, of course, is one was, the anonymity of one made it a little bit harder. But, so there was a reason this came forward in the first part, to solve a problem. So there is, when you said that we're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist, there is a problem. The bylaw is not good, but is this the right solution? That's a debatable thing. Reiko?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I suspect that Councillor Carlson's concern could be addressed by way of an amendment at City Council if the SPC refers it to City Council, rather than killing it on the table here by a vote against it. Again, at the risk of stating the obvious, I understand that to be the case. Am I not correct?
We can make a recommendation that is 4 people against it and 0 for, or some combination thereof. It still goes to council as a recommendation, but it can be a recommendation for or against.
No, I understand that, but okay, let me pose a hypothetical. We have 4 members of SPC, is that not right?
Yes, we do.
By my count. So if 2 voted against the referral and 2 voted for the referral, that means it would die on the table or wither on the vine right here, would it not?
It doesn't die, it means it goes to council as a referral defeated by the SPC.
Oh, got you. And then council can consider it and
Vote
still
against
pass,
the SPC, yeah.
or vote for it, as the case may be. Oh, okay, I got it. Thank you.
So I am getting this all now as clear as mud. What is the general consensus? Are you looking to kill the entire idea? Are you looking to send back a revised? Are you looking to, what are we hearing? Go ahead, John.
I'm certainly in favor of moving it forward to council. The concern that I have is the ambiguity around the positions, legal, ethical, content, investigator. I find that ambiguity concerning, but I think the gist of the matter, if I can use one of Dante's examples, is that I think it's very important that I was referring to Mr. Faust and of course his cohort. I think what's important here is that we recognize whether or not an integrity commissioner is an important piece, and I think investigating complaints as they are put to council is an important component. I think it speaks to a heightened level of transparency. I just am uncomfortable with the expectations of that position. So if it means redraft it with some of that excluded, then I would be in favor of not sending it forward. If council is the appropriate location to review it, to make a decision whether all 3 components are appropriate, then I'm in favor of it. Does that make sense? Thank you.
I still want to remind everybody, though, that if we ask it to be developed as an initiative for the fall budget, then whatever we agree, whatever council eventually agrees to, will only run for 11 months max. It would be seen as a pilot. That would then allow all of council to have information that might determine how they vote at the budget. Go ahead, Rachel.
I was going to say that my main concern was that the costs, just like Councillor Carlson had mentioned, all of a sudden it was like, you know, we're talking about a 2,000 retainer, and then we're all up to 50,000, and then we're thinking about initiatives on a go-forward basis. I understand that everything is conditional upon conditional, but I realize it's not a huge cost in the scheme of the city operating budget, but it is a significant cost if we're talking about very limited experiences with this, especially if you have someone on retainer for $2,000 a month. I know it's not a lot of money, but it is of some concern to me.
Well, and the 50,000 is, I'm used to padding budgets in not-for-profit worlds, but I mean, when you actually look at the 2,000, it's a $22,000 cost for the rest of the year, if there are no complaints made. So that's the minimum amount. Jeff?
You know,
Sorry, Rachel, were you done?
well, for what it's worth is that I'm going to, I'll tell you now, is I'll vote to refer it to City Council, but I think it's going to be left open for amendments, including not only as to what the reference is or what options you want to land on and the cost associated with it. So I don't want to belabor too much at SPC when ultimately the council is going to make the decision anyways.
Keep in mind that the recommendation that went to council last time was from us.
It was, but there was no monetary amount really landed on, and maybe that's the unfortunate piece of it.
Okay, Jeff?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess question through you, and I hate to pose this, but option 2C, if that was the, sorry, I'm beating a dead horse here. If that was the option that, say, now is in my mind, asking maybe Mr. Faust how much the changes that were contemplated to the bylaw, how significant would further changes be to accommodate 2C? I believe, I'm assuming there would have to be a council policy created around it.
I think so far it's cost about $50,000 in this discussion. Sorry. Go ahead and answer the question, please, Mr. Faust.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question for 1 sec? Councillor Carlson, I apologize. It honestly cut out and I missed it.
Oh, no worries. I'm not overly clear and concise these days for some reason. If 2C was the new flavor of the month, how many changes would have to be made to the amendments that have been proposed for 2B to allow that to occur? And further, would there need to be some sort of council policy drafted on how that works, or would that just fall into the code of conduct? I'm just trying to figure out how much extra time, if I'm the only one thinking along these lines, I'll just shut up. But I'd like to know how much extra work would be involved in making 2C a reality or a possibility.
So Councillor Carlson, 2C in and of itself would just be the passing of a resolution to establish the policy. The bylaw already has the framework of a committee of council can decide to hire an investigator. But then that's where the process sort of ends there. There's nothing about, well, how do you actually hire that investigator? What are they doing? 2C was really meant, it could be for any whatever purpose you want it to be, but the initial thought was, if something is better than nothing. If the thought is that our current process doesn't work, here's an option that doesn't actually require many changes, just a resolution to pass policy, but I think greatly improves our current process. And then if you need time to think about whether or not you want to build on that, you can do that, but still have something in place sooner rather than later. The change to the bylaw that I think would probably still be beneficial is that option 1, opening complaints up to the public. And that's because, as I said previously, the public makes complaints, but then they get left out in the cold once they get a counselor on side to actually carry that complaint into the code of conduct process. So I think that was the only amendment to the bylaw that would be required. Looking now where we're at, if that's going to be sort of an end stage rather than a transitional approach, I think some of the terms of reference and greater clarity on reporting periods and times to respond that are in the terms of reference from 2A and 2B would be beneficial to add to that policy to make it more robust process-wise. But as far as changes go, it would be a resolution to pass the policy to operate within the existing framework, but an amendment to change who can make the complaints from a member to a person.
Okay, thank you.
So if we go back to the resolution that we have brought forward, are we then, option 1, opening into the public, it's the one thing I'm not hearing anybody having concerns with, right? That was what council decided. Everybody here is fine with that. Whatever bylaw changes are around opening it to the public, we're all good. The difficulty that people are having with is on the Integrity Commissioner themselves, if they are on a retainer, if they are ad hoc, or if we have it so that whomever the investigators are can choose to go for or council can choose to go for an outside investigator. Is that the sticking point that I'm hearing from everybody? the cost associated with an integrity commissioner, is it the cost or is it the fact that we even would have one? Go ahead, John.
I don't have any difficulty, quite candidly, I don't think the cost is a paramount issue. Not that I'm being flippant in terms of our responsibilities to manage money appropriately. My concern is what our expectations are of this position, and I'm inclined, after listening to the discussions and so forth, to want to move it forward to council to get additional input from the remainder of council. I think we seem to be going around in circle here in terms of our concerns, and I think they've been well voiced, but I think we perhaps need to have a different lens on it, and moving it to council might be that approach I'm suggesting. So that's what I would be in favor of.
This would be the third time it would go to council. Because, I mean, something that goes back and forth between councils and committees, either A, there's something fundamentally wrong with it, or B, we're just having way too much fun with it. So what is the major concern? Is this, like, are people just wanting to try to kibosh this, or is it tweaking it still? Jeff?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Honestly, with the referral we got from council and to the work that's been brought forward, I think it's exactly what council asked us to review and sort of go through. My only last minute questioning is that I've had some time to soak with this, and so I have no problem taking this back to council. I think the work that's been accomplished and been provided is exactly what council asked us to do and accomplish. I don't see any issues with what's in front of me, and I haven't really brought any of those up. I'm just thinking that I may discuss option 2C a little bit more at council, but I think I just would like to say that what's in front of us is exactly what council asked us to review. So thank you.
Okay, so you're saying take this resolution back, debate it at council.
Yes.
Okay, John? Yes. Rachel? That was a long conversation to get back to the starting point.
What's your opinion?
What's my opinion? That if we all do our job, we don't need an integrity commissioner at all, is one of the things. But when they're needed, they're needed. And right, like, and that's the difficulty is the old system isn't working. I'm willing to try something for a year and refine it better in the budget.
Could I ask Ms. Schmidt-Rempel for her opinion? She's sat through this and been quite quiet.
I would tend to agree with Councillor Crowson. If having not been through the previous system, I don't know that it's not working, but I do rely on the expertise of our previous council members, that we do need to look at something new. And if we're offered an opportunity for a pilot project, why not take up that opportunity to look at a pilot and then see how we move it forward when it comes to budget discussion times?
Jeff, you're yellow again.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just a quick final question. If we did not make any changes to our current process, if we threw everything out that's been proposed, what are the options for members of the public? Because I was under the opinion that there were always options for the members of public if there was a grievance or an investigation to go forward. Is it not through municipal affairs?
Well, they can bring something forward under our code of conduct, right? They can do that. The difficulty is it then goes into closed session and they can't be told what the outcome was because that's the difficulty because it's brought forward by a councillor and not by the members. So that's the difficulty we're seeing inside. But you're right. They can always look to the province, et cetera, how many people are going to take those sort of options. And is our system the transparent one we want is where this conversation started 2 years ago.
Right. And just further to that, it's not that it can't be shared with the member of public or the public at large. It's just the council has to decide whether or not to share that information.
You're right.
Correct?
It could be brought out by council as a whole, but there is no guarantee that person would ever find out the outcome of their concern. With the
But
changes, they would.
Thank you. And so, but I guess I'm just going back to what Mr. Faust said, that there are very few municipalities that do have this in place. And so there are already avenues. If there is some flagrant transgression that a member of the public wants to bring forward, there's always options, correct?
Mr. Faust, do you want to take that?
So I think we need to be clear. There are not options within the framework of our current code of conduct bylaw unless they get a counselor to make that complaint. That's somewhat of a technicality, because if a counselor has stepped offside, the complaint process will move from the code of conduct likely into the public eye, in the media, in the newspaper. So can the public make a complaint? Yes. And will their complaint be heard? Possibly. Will it follow the code process and reach a resolution that way? Not unless a counselor brings it on. There is the provincial ombudsman, but the ombudsman is more concerned with the process rather than the outcome. And with their jurisdiction, they may not get involved here.
And playing devil's advocate back to you, Councillor Carlson, if all 9 of us are complicit in whatever the complaint is, who's going to bring it forward on their behalf?
That was my thought around the flagrant transgression, because there are cases in the province where citizen complaints do go to municipal affairs or the provincial ombudsman and are investigated. So that's what I was trying to point out, that us not having this does not eliminate folks' options. I think we need to be clear on that, whichever way this goes, there are always options for folks.
Right, but there are good options and not so good options. Go ahead, Mr. Faust.
Thank you. And I just add to Councillor Carlson's point that it's worth reflecting on what the intention would be of establishing this ad hoc process or an integrity commissioner. If it is to adjudicate claims and that's it, then yeah, public can always have a process. But if it's meant to create that public trust, increase transparency, and gain confidence with the public that decisions everyone's making are valid, then our current process doesn't necessarily accomplish that. But any one of the 3 options are likely viable to continue to grow that public confidence.
Thank you for that. And just a final quick question. It's probably in the material. Mr. Faust, you'll tell me which page. How many, if it was just the retainer, the 2,000 that's being proposed per month, how many, say there were frivolous complaints, say I was launching, Rayco looked at me funny in the grocery store. Dave Smith, Councillor Smith looked at me funny in the grocery store. Councillor Smith cut me off in traffic and then raised a finger in salute. How many of those would eat up the $2,000 retainer? Or would those even go? I don't know what the process would be.
Councillor Carson, as a former practicing private lawyer, it's very hard to estimate an amount, as I don't have control over the other side, and nor do we. It could be a very simple, frivolous, vexatious complaint with a mountain of documents to go through.
Yes.
Or it could be a quite serious breach with very minimal and simplistic facts. So that I think the issue that everyone's having with struggling with the ambiguity is we're trying to guess and predict life and how people are going to act and respond to future events that we don't know are going to occur yet because we haven't done them or even contemplated them yet. If it takes an hour a complaint and it's 2,000, then 10 complaints. But if one of those complaints takes longer, you're down to 5. It's difficult without a crystal ball.
Agreed. Thank you.
So I'm going to go back to my original question. Are we moving forward with this resolution? Whether or not you'll support it at council is your own decision. But is this the resolution we as a group wish to take forward? Councillor Carlson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just repeat what I said before. Council referred us to explore and get further options or flesh out what they referred to us, and I think that has been done by Mr. Faust. So I have no problem referring this back to council, and we'll see how the discussion and vote goes at council.
Okay. So would someone like to move this then as our resolution?
I'll move it.
Councillor Middleton Hope has moved. All in favor? Any opposed? Pardon?
Jeff vote in favor? I didn't see
I
it.
have no idea, but since he didn't jump up on my screen, we're going to assume he did, unless he argues with it. All right. So it moves us now to section 7, and we have a resolution coming out of the closed meeting, a human resources matter. Be it resolved that the Governance Standing Policy Committee direct that the confidential report and closed meeting discussions with respect to human resources matter remain confidential pursuant to sections 17, disclosure to personal privacy, 24, advice from officials, and 29, information that will be available to the public of the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. And further be it resolved that this matter be referred to the February 1st, 2022 council meeting closed session, and that the General Manager of People and Culture provide the requested information. I need someone to move that resolution. Oh, yeah. All right, so that is the resolution before us. Any questions or comments within this resolution? Okay. All in favor? And opposed? All right, the resolution actually fails, but it goes forward as to council anyways as a fail at SBC, where it will get overturned. All right. Oh, sorry, I'm just predicting the future as well. Brings us to the end. We are adjourned.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I don't think I have anything else this week, so have a good weekend, everyone.
I've got 2 more meetings tomorrow, so
Oh, crap, I probably do in just